Hello everyone, in this week's tutorial we're going to be showing you how to sew up your fingerless glove. We are going to start by inserting the thumb piece into the trank. We are then going to show you how to sew up the fingers and fit the fourchettes into the glove itself. Let's get on with it. So when you're laying your leather out, you will notice that it will have quite a lot of give in one direction. That sort of feels quite elastic. It will have a little bit of give sort of going up and down, but not as much. So when we're making gloves, we want the stretch to go across the hand, so we want to place our pattern pieces out so that the stretch works with us rather than against us. So again, I would always advise making a mock-up pair of gloves so that you can work out any problem areas, any areas where you may need to adjust the fit. And if you're a bit time limited, just making to fit your larger hand is often a really good indicator if there's going to need to be anything that's adjusted. So when you're laying out your pattern pieces, your stretch will go across the hand. So my arrow at the bottom here I've popped on just as a little reminder to make sure that I've got the stretch going across, and the same for the thumb piece, and again that's on both sides and on the fourchette as well. So the next step will be to get the pieces laid on, working with the stretch, and then we will be cutting everything out. So you'll be cutting out one trank which is faced this way round, and then you'll turn it over and draw the other way round to get the left hand side. The same with the thumb piece. You'll have it draw one this way, draw around the second one, and then with the fourchettes we're going to be cutting 6 with the sort of the wider part facing to the left, and then we cut another 6 with the wider part facing to the right, making sure always that you are working with the stretch. At no point turn it round, and you can cut out your pieces so they are quite close together, but obviously if you're making a mock-up you want to use slightly perhaps the sort of areas that aren't as good so that you keep the premium areas for your actual glove. So play about with it, remember which way round and which orientation so that you don't cut 2 lefts or 2 rights. And then with your silver pen you will draw around the outlines, you'll mark through all of your holes, and the first thing to do before we start sewing the actual trank is to punch the holes in the design so that it will look a little bit like this, because we want that punched before we sew anything together. When we're inserting a thumb, it's really important to make sure that the right points are matched up with each other to help you get everything in the right position. Remembering as well that these are reversed when you do the left hand side of the glove. So as we look here, you can see that I have the trank, I've got the cardboard one for the left hand side and the leather one for the right hand side. We've got points A, B, C and D here, and then they are reversed on the right hand side, A, B, C and D. You have corresponding marks on your thumb template, so your A, B, C and D, and then equally when they're reversed you've got them in that sort of mirror opposite. So when you're sewing your gloves up it's really important to match those points up. I have drawn on my leather with the silver pen whilst I was cutting out, but also I wouldn't normally mark up A, B, C and D, but for the purposes of sort of helping me explain what I'm doing, then that's why I've marked it up. So I will go on and rub that off, and then we will get to clipping our leather together to check for fit, and then we'll start sewing the thumb piece in. So the position of the thumb piece is exactly the same as it would be in our regular glove. The difference is of course that we've cut off that top section, so it just means that we'll alter our start point when we start stitching. I've clipped the thumb piece into position just to give you a sort of a bit of an indicator of what that's going to start looking like. The clips are just sort of roughly in position. They are sat on where I'm going to be sewing, so I don't put any unnecessary marks onto the leather. And I am then going to get my threads ready so that we can get the thumb piece in first, and we'll sew that and tack that into position so that we get the ease in the right position, and then we will move on to the fingers. Now when you are cutting your glove out, don't necessarily cut your fingers until you're ready to sew them. You will have noticed that I've cut my index finger. That's because I wanted to check something about the fit and the instructions that I was going to give you. So keep your fingers completely closed until we're ready to sew them. So I'm going to get ready to tack this into position and get my sewing threads lined up as well. So I've got A, B, C and D all tacked into position. I've just left a couple of clips in just so I can sort of show you what that looks like. Obviously if you're doing the other hand, then it's going to be a mirror image on the reverse. And what I'm planning to do now is I'll have 2 needles on the go. I'll start sewing at point B, where I will come across from B to C and then down to D, and then I will start a thread again at point B, and I will come from B to A and then sew up the rest of that particular thumb piece. So if I can just show you on this particular glove, so this is point B, so I'll be going from B to C to D, and then starting a second thread going from B to A, and then I haven't tacked in the rest of the glove, that the thumb piece that I'll be easing into position just yet, because I know that there might be a little bit of movement as I'm sewing just to access these particular points, so I didn't want to sew it down in case I rip the leather. So once I've sewn B, C and D and then B to A, I will then tack that into position and get the thumb in. To sew the glove, I'm going to be using a betweens number 10, which is this one here, to do my tacking. I'm going to be using a betweens number 7 to do the main sewing, and obviously we're doing a stab stitch here. For the tacking, I am just using a sort of general polyester sewing thread, and that's quite fine, and it'll go through the 10 nice and easily to make my tacking stitches. When I'm doing the sewing, I am just using a black thread. This is a Coats Duet, which is 100% polyester. It's one I've fairly recently discovered, and I really do sort of like the effect when I'm sewing. So I'll be using 2 strands of the black, 1 strand of the yellow for tacking, and both my tacking threads and my sewing threads will have a layer of wax on them to help them go through the leather with a bit more ease. To start my thread off, I'm going to do a little bit of a buttonhole loop like we've done before. I've gone through the back of the leather with my thread once. I'm going to go through a second time to make the loop, but I'm also just checking that I can't actually see the needle from the front. I'm also pinching my excess. There's a lot to do in this little area, and then before I pull the loop tight, I'm going to take my needle back through it, pull it down nice and tight, secure it against the leather. I'm then going to, I could do a second stitch if I wish. I'm then going to snip off that tail nice and close to where we started, making sure that I don't actually cut off my sewing thread, which I have done before, and then I'm going to bring my needle out so that I can do a little back stitch to start me off as I join these 2 points together. So what that's going to look like, I'm just going to come up, I'll be in my seam allowance, but I do like to sort of go back on myself with my first stitch, as I find that just gives me a little bit of security when I'm joining pieces together. One of the first things I'm going to do though, before we actually sew anything, is to just flatten that knot out a little bit more. So to flatten the knot out, I'm going to just be using the very end of what I call a folding hammer that's often used in shoemaking, but anything that you've got, as long as you've got a flat surface. What you can also do is put a little bit of scrap leather to act as a barrier if your surface isn't very smooth, because you just want to hammer the knot that you've just made nice and flat, and that's more sort of practicality and comfort when we're making our gloves. So I can run my finger over that now, and that is much flatter. So we're going to get lined up and start our back stitch with our sewing. I've started my thread off on the thumb piece that we're inserting, and I've brought my needle out onto point B on the trank. I'm going to be doing a very small back stitch to start off our joining of these two pieces together. I'm going to leave that tacking stitch in for the moment, and I just want to make a nice small back stitch to bring these two pieces of leather together. So it's going to look a little bit like that, and I'm going to sew along from B to C. Now, if you notice that your thread has quite a lot of wax on it, you can just ease some of that off by rubbing your fingers along the thread itself. So now, just like we've done with our previous pre-stitch, I'm just going to work my way along from B to C, making sure that my stitches are small and even. What we don't want to do is have them so tiny that you end up perforating the leather. So it's always worth doing a little bit of practice, getting your eye in, because the key thing with this type of stitching and any kind of handwork is making sure that your stitch length and your stitch gap are consistent, so that you achieve that all the way along your work. Having said that, one of the things that often hand stitchers have to sort of think about is their tolerance, because sometimes you can find that you can do a lovely line of stitching and then carry on, and then you realize coming back a few stitches that you might have an uneven stitch. So you've got to almost be prepared to identify what your tolerance is and where you're prepared to unpick and where you think you'll be able to just sort of carry on. For me, I notice that sometimes I might be a little bit uneven, or a stitch might be at a slight angle, and 1 or 2 degrees is fine for me, but if it's beyond that, then I'll change it. Sometimes I find that I can get to bring the needle out on one side and I think, yep, absolutely, it looks fabulous, yet when I turn it over on the other side, it's clearly very off. So it's about perhaps sometimes just checking both sides of your work as you are sewing along. I've stitched from point B along to point C, and I'm getting ready to change direction. So what can be quite helpful is to almost sort of take a slightly narrower stitch on the inside of a corner when you're turning it, and having a slightly longer stitch on the sort of the wider outside area. I find that by making sure I get right into the corner with my stitch sort of coming through the leather, it really enables me to keep those sort of points nice and tight and nice and together. So I'm now going to do a slightly longer stitch on this side, but still slightly narrow on the inside there, just to help me get around the corner, secure that line of stitching, and then I'm going to carry on up to point D. I've just finished going from B to C to D, and I've just stitched down about just over a centimetre or so into the part of the thumb piece that I would normally ease in, just to help sort of stabilise the corner, because now I'm going to come back over to point B, and this time I'm going to start a new thread and I'm going to be heading to point A. I'm going to break the tacking stitch that I've got here so I can start my thread on this part of the thumb piece, the bit I'm actually inserting, and then when I come to do my back stitch I will bring it together out into the trank on the other side, just like we did before, to get things started. So let's get underway. I'm starting my thread off in exactly the same way that I've done before, and I've gone through a little bit of the back of the leather, checking that my needle isn't visible from the front. And this time I've already gone through once, so on the second time through I'm going to take my thread back through my loop, pull it all tight, use the other end just to make sure it's really tight against the leather, give it a little bit of a hammer to make sure it's nice and flat, and then I'm going to cut the tail off. Then we're going to get ready to do our back stitch. So I'm going to come out and I want to bring my thread out on point B, but I'm going to work back to the corner this time. So I'm coming out, hopefully you can see that, about on my sort of stitch line, coming out with a little bit of space so I can do my back stitch. And again, keep your implements out of the way because your thread will just love to curl around them. So let's pull that one through. Sometimes if your thread is just sort of settling into sewing, you might find that you've got to just pull it, keep it under a bit of tension whilst you sew everything together. Because we're using 2 threads, we also want to make sure that they go through nice and evenly through the leather, so that we don't end up with any loops or any sort of uneven stitches anywhere like that. Now I can just tell that within what I'm sewing I do have a loop of thread that is caught, so I'm just going to pull it out. There we go, I can feel it now, it's moved, and then we will carry on with our next bit. So my stitch now that I'm going to do is going to join most of our leather at the top here, at the very top. So it's going to be going through the stitch I've already done to bring our first 2 pieces of leather, so that I can get a nice even line and a secure join up at the top here. So that's going to be just a little bit of poking my needle through to make sure that I come out in the right spot, to make sure that I'm actually on the right point and that my leather is nice and even. So am I happy with that? Yep, there we go. So I'll just run that through the fingers, make sure it doesn't knot up on itself, and that is our first stitch underway. So I'm now just want to make sure that as I am sewing along, I'm checking that my edges are level. I don't want anything to sort of be pulled out of shape. So before I start, I'm just taking an extra bit of time to make sure everything is as I want it to be, and then we're going to get underway with our stitching. So we're still keeping in the same pattern of our stitches, and we're just going to work our way along down to point A, just like we did when we were putting the gloves together. And what I'll just check is that I'm coming out in the right spots on the back. So just keep a nice even tension. If your leather is wrinkling, then you know that you've pulled your thread too tight. If you can see daylight, you know that you haven't pulled it tight enough and it's too loose. Sometimes if I've pulled one a little bit tight, you can just sort of ease it out before you move on to the next one. So just take a moment, always check what you're doing and where things have ended up, and then move on. So I'm now going to work down to point A, and I will come around the corner just like I did on the other side at point D, and I will stop just about 1 centimetre away from point A. So I'll come all the way down here and then all the way just about 1 centimetre in, and then get the rest of the thumb piece tacked into position so that the excess is evenly distributed. Points A, B, C and D are now in, and I've still got my threads attached, so I can then now clip the excess of the thumb piece into position on the trank, and then I'm going to tack it, and then I'm going to carry on with my pre-stitch or my stab stitching. To do the easing, I basically want to keep the leather on the trank sort of fairly taut, and I want to just place very carefully, without putting it under tension, the leather on the thumb piece itself. I'm going to then clip that into position. So again, I want to keep the outside where the trank is under a little bit of tension, and then I just want to ease the edge in. So as I go round, I'm sort of pulling the edges so that they're level with each other, but I'm keeping the trank under tension but not the thumb piece. So I'm going to work my way around. I find that's the best way of easing something in. So I'll secure my centre bit, and then I'll come down one side for a couple of clips, come down the other side, swapping sides until I reach the midpoint at the bottom. The reason I do it that way, I often find that it means I don't end up with a massive load of excess on one side. It means that I can get it distributed fairly evenly. So I'm pulling it so they're level. So you'll notice that my clips aren't necessarily going to be very far apart, because I'm working on sort of easing two curves into position with each other. So I'm keeping the trank, which is the outer one, under some tension, and I'm just easing and pressing just very gently the thumb piece itself against it. So just, and I'll work my way around. Now you'll notice that we start to get the odd wrinkle here and there, but as we start to sew, those wrinkles will very easily disappear. So I'm going, keeping the outside under a bit of tension. So I'm not pulling it really hard, I'm just sort of pulling it enough to sort of feel a slight sort of bit of stretch, but not enough to overstretch it, just a little bit of tension on the leather, and then we clip. So I'm still clipping on my seam allowance line, and I'm working my way down to sort of the base of the thumb. So I'll just keep doing one or two clips per side, and then just ease that in all the way down. And it can be a bit alarming when you get sort of a big fold of fabric or a big kind of bit that you think, well, they're not level, but when you start to sew them, you will notice that that does even itself out. So even though I've got a little gap there, that will settle into position when I start sewing. And actually that seems to have worked really nicely. If I then get this last part level and in position, yeah, looking good. Now with this particular sort of way of easing, I often find it helpful to then tack it into position. Because we're working on a curve, it often means that we've got to just add in a few more stitches to help keep that curve nice and level. So the next thing is our tacking stitches, and then after that we'll be able to carry on sewing. So we've now tacked our thumb piece into position against our trank. As I go around, I'm going to be sewing, I suppose I'm going to be sewing both sides sort of one after the other. So I'll do a little bit on the left hand side, I'll do a little bit on the right, bit more on the left, bit more on the right, and just work my way down till I meet somewhere at the base here. As I sew, and you'll notice if I sort of pick this up that these two layers aren't level at the moment, so I need to make sure that as I sew them that I push them so that they are level when I'm stitching the thumb piece into the trank itself. So the next thing is to work my way down, sewing the thumb piece in, and then eventually my threads will meet somewhere near the base of the thumb here, and we're going to be allowing for a little bit of an overlap. So as my threads start to meet, I'm going to try and make sure that I keep an even stitch pattern so that when I do overlap and finish my thread off, it just looks completely seamless. It can be really tempting to hook your needle under your tacking stitch to remove it and just pull it out. That does run the risk of potentially hooking underneath and pulling the thread out without actually breaking it, which could rip the leather if you're not careful. So what I would advise is either to use a very fine pair of scissors or a stitch ripper and just break the thread and then pull it out. Don't be tempted, because it could be costly and you could end up with a tear in your leather. So please don't do that. Always take care when removing your tacking stitches. I'm at the point now where I'm ready to finish my threads off. As you can see, I've come out and I'm able to overlap my stitches now to start to create my sort of finishing stitches. So what I'm going to do, the thread that's come down the right hand side, I'm going to follow the same hole pattern and overlap by 3 or 4 stitches coming towards the left. The thread that's come down from the left, I'm going to do this exactly the same thing, overlap by a few stitches coming down, heading off towards the right hand side, and then I will show you how to finish your thread off. My first thread has now overlapped by 4 stitches, and I've come out as though I'm going to make a 5th stitch, but what I'm going to do this time is just put my needle back in. So I'm still following the pattern of the existing holes, but I'm only going to be going through the first layer of leather. So I want to just check now the inside so that I'm actually coming out on the inside of the leather. So I've gone through the hole that marks where the stitch is, but I've just come out after having gone through that single layer of leather. So I'm going to pull the thread through, making sure that both my threads are nice and level. And now what I'm looking to do is to pick up, I don't want to go pulling this really hard, because what will happen is it'll just in effect pull the stitches apart, which we don't want to do. But I just want to expose some of the existing stitches because I want to hook underneath them. So I've travelled under that first stitch, and I'm now going to go under my second stitch to do my finishing off. So I'm going to pull until the loop is almost flat, take my needle back through, pull that nice and tight, and then I am just going to travel under one more stitch to finish the thread off. Let me just make sure that I've got that. I don't want to have my needle showing on the outside, so just have a quick visual check, pull that through, and then make sure it's nice and flat, and then I'm going to cut my thread off, and that is my first thread finished. I'm now going to repeat that, doing exactly the same to finish this thread off. So this thread will come down by about 3 or 4 stitches, and then I will repeat the process to finish it off somewhere around here, just like we've done with the first thread. Once I have finished and completed my knots, I just like to give the stitches where the knots have been finished off just a little tap to help flatten everything out. We're not sort of hammering it and leaving a mark on the leather, just a gentle tap to help settle the stitches after you have finished the thread. And there we have our completed and inserted thumb piece. The next step that we're going to do is to cut down our index finger, which is our first one with our sort of wide finger that we've got here. We'll open those up as I've done, and we're going to get our fourchettes sewn ready. So when the fourchette is ready to be inserted, it's going to look a little bit like this one here. And the first thing we need to do, and this is where you can clip or tack them together, again this may well just be your personal preference for that. Make sure you've got a double waxed thread, and we're going to start off in very similar to what we did in my previous tutorial about the glove making. I'm going to do a couple of sort of over sews to start me off, and I find leaving a bit of a tail is really helpful, and we're just going to go through that a couple of times. When you're pulling the stitch tight, you want to make sure that the stitch sits all against this edge, and we're just going to do one more stitch, and this time I'm going to take my thread back through the loop, pull it nice and tight, give it a bit of a tug, snip off the tail. And one thing that can be quite useful, particularly with your starting and finishing stitches, is to just give them a little bit of a hammer just to help flatten them out, and you'll know when you've done it, because it will feel quite different. It'll feel like quite an obvious knot, but when you've flattened it, it will feel much flatter and much more comfortable. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to work my way up towards the straight edge of the fourchette. So I always start at the base, because that's the bit that sits at the base of the finger here. The straight edge kind of mirrors the back of the hand, and the reason I start down here is so that when I insert the fourchette into the glove, I insert the straight edges first, and then I insert the edges on the underside. So once I get to the end of my line of sewing here, I'll be able to leave a tail and leave my thread attached, ready for the next stage. So as I'm sewing this, I'm now going to go through each hole twice. So this is sometimes known as streetly stitch, which you can use on the outside of your gloves, but this is just, in effect, it's over sewing but going through each hole twice. and we're going to work my way up, and then I'm going to repeat my starting stitch to just secure the thread at the top there. So we've finished the sewing and joining the base of the fourchette together. Sometimes the sort of very tip up here can get a little fluffy and can get in the way when you're inserting the fourchette into the glove. Sometimes you can just give it a little trim just to lop off the furry ends. It's not going to affect the actual construction of the glove, but it can just get rid of something that can poke out when you're making the glove. So I've just given it a little trim. As you can see, the bits that I've cut off are actually very small, but that will then give my fourchette a sort of a nicer fit within the finger. So the next thing now is to get them into the fingers. So we're clipped in, and we're just sort of, I know it's probably slightly difficult to see with all the sewing clips kind of in the way there, but it is quite a nice sort of fit so far. I can also see how my sort of thumb looks too, and that's looking good. So I'm now going to go ahead and start tacking the fourchette into position so I can get rid of the clips, because they can get in the way when you're sewing. So I shall show you what that tacking stage looks like. But in effect, what I've done is clipped where there is going to be a seam. So there's a couple of clips along each seam. So I've got 2 for the first fourchette against each finger, and I've got 2 on the underside as well. So we'll just get those tacked now and show you what that looks like. Our fourchette is tacked and in position. As you start to go from sort of a flat form to something much more three-dimensional, sometimes the leather can look at slightly odd angles. It can just sort of, makes you think you might have done something wrong. If you have got serious drag marks, and by that I mean you've actually got a stretch within your leather, that's when you know that you've got something wrong. When you have something that is just starting to take the shape, it will sort of start to take on its own life. So don't worry about that. It's when you've got serious drag marks, or if something is tight. So say for example, if one of my tacking stitches was really tight and there were drag marks in the leather, I know then that there would be something wrong. So now we're going to start stitching up one of our fingers. First, I've got my thread attached, and I'm just going to show you how to do that. I always like to start with a bit of a back stitch. So I've brought my thread out on the inside of my fourchette about a stitch width away from the seam. So that might be a little tricky to see, so I'll just zoom you in so we can just show you what that looks like. So the stitch where I've come out is literally about a sort of stitch width away, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going back on myself, and I want to bring my needle out somewhere by the V, where at the sort of the base of the finger. And I find the back stitch is just a really good way of making sure that the fourchette sits really nicely in position. So I'm going through, and I can just very delicately poke my needle, and I can just about make it out under the surface of the leather. So I find my sort of back stitch and the stitches where I'm changing direction may well be slightly kind of wider or slightly longer on those initial stitches. Not by much, but you will notice it as the stitcher. So I've got my back stitch underway. That is now done. I'm going to make sure that my fourchette sits nice and sort of securely at the base of the finger, and then I am going to start working my way up the finger. So I'm still continuing with the pre-stitch, or the sort of stab stitch, and sometimes when you start off you may find that your first couple of stitches are a little closer together, just to accommodate getting the base of the fourchette in position. So sometimes it can wriggle about a bit, but just bear with it whilst you get those sort of first couple of stitches in, and it will settle down. So we've got here, yeah, we've got our first stitch, and we're now underway. So that first stitch is just sort of sat at the base of the finger there, and then we are now just going to start stitching and work our way up to almost to the end of the finger, keeping the same stitch pattern. So I'm just show you where I'm going to end up working to, and we're going to come all the way up here pretty much to that tacking stitch, and then we will stop. I've stitched up to the end of my finger, but I haven't yet finished the thread off. I'm going to leave that hanging and attached for the moment, and what I'm going to do is to come over to the other side, and I'm going to start to sew up from the sort of palm side of the hand, from the base of the finger up to the where the sort of the glove point finishes, and then I'm going to show you what we do next. I'm starting my thread in the very same way that I've done before. I've made my loop, as you can just about see from here, and now I'm going to take my needle back through that loop, and I'm going to pull the knot nice and tight to start my thread off. You can, as you're starting down by the fourchette, you might find it easier to start within those stitches as well. I like to sort of make sure that my tail, when I'm starting my thread off, is always kind of pointing to the inside, so that I don't start my thread off the other way round, purely because if you don't trim your tail quite close to the base, it can sort of poke out through your stitching. So I always make sure that my tail is pointing to the inside, cut that extra bit off, and then I'm going to start with a back stitch on the inside of my fourchette, just like I have done with this side as well. So I'll be bringing my needle out here to do my first stitch. For my thread, I've now come out, as you can see, in the fourchette. I'm now going to make sure that my edges are level, and I'm going to go back down, doing a back stitch, so that I come out somewhere near the base of the glove. That looks good to me. So you can just about see my needle here, and I'm basically just going to repeat the stitching I did on my previous finger, and make sure that one, sometimes when you do your initial stitches, the base of the fourchette can feel like it's wobbling about a bit, but just, you know, keep going with what you're doing. Make sure your edges are level, your stitches are consistent, and it does usually by the second and third stitch start to sit in place. So I'm going to just work my way along, and bear in mind that those initial early stitches might well be a little bit longer than your regular sewing stitches. Again, it's looking for consistent length and a consistent gap in between what you're doing. So I've done my first stitch there on the outside, which hopefully we've got in focus, and then I've come up again on my inside. I'm going to remove my tacking stitch with my stitch ripper, and I'm going to work my way along until I reach the end of the finger. So I'll come up just after that tacking stitch here, and that's where I will stop and show you what to do next. Both sides of my index finger are now stitched, and I've left the threads attached. I've tried the glove on, and this is just to sort of help sort of give me a sense that I know that how the fit is going, and then I now need to trim off the unwanted fourchette piece, and we're going to finish the threads off. So I'm going to use my silver pen to help me, and some of you may find it easier to mark the leather on the inside for this step. Some of you may find it easier to eyeball it and mark it on the outside. Have a bit of a play and see which one works for you. But basically what we're looking to do is to mark the edge of the fourchette, which is level with the end of your finger. So that's my one for the palm view of my hand, and I'm now just going to move my hand around so that I can then get the silver on this side into position. Now you do whichever is easier for you. I've now marked that on, and what I'm going to do is making sure that my threads are well out of harm's way. I'm going to just trim off between those two dots with my long scissors so that my fourchette is then level with the top of my fingers. Now, to finish the thread off, let's just clear these bits out of the way. So I'm going to bring the needle over the top, and I'm going to just double check first of all that I'm happy with that being level. No, actually I think I might just be taking a fraction more off of that edge. So I'm just going to have another quick look, push the rest of the finger out of the way. Yes, I think I will. I've just a sort of an extra millimetre or so, but I just want to trim off. There we go. So it's not much at all. So I'm going to eyeball it and have a quick look. Yeah, I'm happy with that. That looks good from both sides. So be nice and accurate. Always check. It can help sometimes to sort of then put it on and just sort of double check, are you happy with what you've got there or not? And if you're not, obviously you can trim it. We're then going to finish our threads off. Now, if you have watched my other gloving videos about finishing your thread off at the end of your fingers, then this is basically the same method that we're going to do now. So I'm going to bring my thread over the top for a couple of stitches. So you may find that just at the sort of the very top of your glove, the end of your finger, at this particular point you may have some stitches that are quite close together, but they're going to sort of have quite an important role. So I've gone round my finger, just a couple of extra stitches just to hold everything nice and securely without catching on your other threads. So it's going to be a bit of a move to get everything in the right order. And then I am going to just take my needle so as I'm looking to finish my thread off, it's trying to sort of finish it off in the most discreet way. You can just of course go back down using the same holes and just go in and out of the glove. If you wanted to sort of do it a bit more discreetly, I'm going to go like I'm going to make a third stitch, and I am going to walk down a couple of stitches. So I'm going to bring my needle out, so I've gone in through the hole where I've made my top stitches, and I'm going to come out at the next stitch down, and I'm going to just follow the holes so that I'm overlapping my stitches by just a couple of stitches. So I'm using the same holes. Just take a moment to check you're coming out in the right place. So that's 1, 2, lovely. Now this is where it becomes very similar to finishing the fingertip. I'm going to go like I'm going to make a third stitch, but I'm only going through one piece of leather. So that's that outer leather where my needle's going in. I'm going to bring my needle out in between my 2 layers of leather. And this is where, if you can see the stitches, you might be able to do your loops, or you will just weave it in and out. So before I do anything, I want to make sure that's nice and flat. And I'm then going to take my needle in, and again I want to check that my needle isn't visible on either side, and I'm just going to weave it through some of the leather, just keeping an eye on that. Yep, we're not visible, and we're going to come through. It's cold weather here in the UK, and I keep thinking I'm okay, but then I realise I've flung my thimble across the floor again. So go back in, and I'm going to do the same again. I'll probably do 3 stitches altogether, and this is where I'm just literally trying to stay near where I've stitched. Check that it's not coming through on both sides. Now your thimble is really good for helping you push the needle through. It can also be really helpful to have a pair of pliers. If it starts to get a little bit tough, you can just use your pliers to help pull your thread through. So each time I just want to smooth it out, and then I'm going to make one more incision and just sort of do one more round of sort of weaving in between my 2 layers, checking of course that I'm not coming out where I am going to be seeing my needle, and I will pull that out for the 3rd time. So we'll just flatten that out. Because I've got 2 threads, I do want to make sure that both of them sit nice and flat against what I'm doing, but I also don't want my leather to be wrinkling, so I'm just going to take a moment to flatten that out. Now I want to get rid of my threads, and all I'm going to do is just tug this thread up a little bit, snip that thread off, and then because I've given it a bit of a tug, it'll want to sink back into the fabric a little bit, into the leather, sorry, a little bit more. Now all that's left to do is to give my stitches and my finishing stitches a little bit of a hammer, and you should be able to then feel that they should feel nice and differently. They should feel smooth. If you feel like a kind of almost like you've got a sort of a very, very small stone in there, give it a bit more of a hammer to flatten the knot out. And remember, you may need to use a barrier if your hammer isn't a leather hammer or it's not particularly smooth, because you don't want any marks from your leather transferring onto your leather. Now that is how you finish your finger off. So I'm going to do exactly the same to this side. I'm going to go over the top for a few stitches to hold that in position, and then I'm going to come back on myself for a couple of stitches and then weave in and out. And that basically is how you would finish your finger off. When I come to sew my middle and fourth fingers, what I'll be doing is repeating this process, making sure that the finger is tacked in position to start with, making sure that I sew the back of the hand in position on both of them, and then do the front of the hand. But I'll try it on once I've stitched the fourchettes that sit in place on either side of the finger. So once they're in, I will then make my marks to cut the leather off, and I'll repeat that process for the remaining fingers. And when we get to do the fifth finger, and I will show you this, we will insert the fourchette in the same way that we've done for the other fingers, and we will bring the sewing up the fingers like we've done and leave the fourchette ready for trimming. And then we will explain why we've started sewing up the side a little bit further up, and then how to then trim off that final fourchette, which is exactly the same, but I just tend to wait until I've got that final side in position before I make any trimming of my fourchettes. When if you're used to sort of dressmaking and working with the grain, it might feel quite counterintuitive to be cutting the fourchette at an angle, but this is just a very sort of basic method to show you how to make the pair of gloves. And then once you've got that kind of method in place, you can of course then adjust it and experiment with sort of different lengths of finger, or sort of having one side longer than the other, but it's because you're cutting it at an angle rather than actually sort of parallel to that straight edge. It can feel a bit counterintuitive, but work with it because you do get a really nice effect created at the end. So good luck, and I will see you for the last bits. As I'm getting ready to insert my next fourchette into position, I've noticed that I've actually cut down the side of this finger somewhat unevenly, particularly at the top here. So what I'm going to do is just take my leather scissors, and I'm just going to turn it round, because what I want to do is I'm going to trim this uneven edge, but what I want to do is just to sort of gently taper it into the side so that I actually just get rid of that little cutout section. So I'm going to actually taper it and probably finish cutting somewhere down here, so it'll be a real slither by the time I'm here, and I just want to sort of straighten that edge off. So I've turned it upside down, I've lined up my scissors, and I'm literally just going to take a nice long thin taper to cut that little bit off. And you can see we've not taken off very much there at all, but it's now given me a much better edge with which to sew the side of my finger and put my fourchette in position. I've mentioned quite a few times that if you get diagonal stretch marks when you're sewing your glove, it's quite important to stop and find out what's causing those. I've also got another example to show you here, that my tacking stitch, if you can see, this is the fourchette, this is the trank, and you can see there that I've got a slight sort of bubble occurring in my trank, which is caused by the tension of having my fourchette and trank misaligned. So what I've actually done is I've made sure that my trank that the fourchette is secure in the trank at the bottom here, I've leveled the edges as I've worked my way up, and you can see that I've almost pulled the trank that way a little bit too much. So now what I can do is when I reach the tacking stitch, I'll break it, but I'll then just smooth out the trank against the fourchette and carry on sewing. So that little bubble there will disappear, but it's worth just looking, and I can actually see what's happened as my tacking stitch, it might be slightly tricky for me to show you, but my tacking stitch is actually sort of almost looking like it's being dragged down to my right, and it's on a sort of a diagonal, which sort of suggests that. So that's often a big clue, is to look what your tacking stitches are doing, look which direction your leather is being pulled, but also if you get a little bubble, that's often a sign that something's wrong as well. So just have a moment to double check everything is as you would expect it to be, and then carry on sewing. Obviously, going from a two-dimensional to a three-dimensional form, the leather will want to start to sort of take on its own shape, but it's just making sure that you haven't got anything that's going to radically alter it, like a bubble or a stretch mark. I've now stitched the fourchettes into position either side of my middle finger, and what I'm looking to do now is to then just make the marks so that I can trim my fourchettes off. And what I want to do is just make sure that I keep the edge of the edges of the threads out of the way, because I don't want to accidentally cut them off during this process, but I want to just mark up so I can see where I need to cut off my fourchette. So I can make my first mark there. I'm just going to have to just move my fingers around a little bit so I can see where the leather needs to be marked. This side's probably a little bit harder, but we shall get there. So I might mark, rather than try and twist my hand round, which could look a little bit tricky, I might just mark the inside of this one, because that's a little bit easier to see. So when you're marking your leather, you just want to mark up where the top of the glove comes, so that you can then cut off the leather on the fourchette and trim it to size. You are going to find that you're not going to sort of be going straight across the fourchette, as I mentioned earlier, so it will sort of feel perhaps counterintuitive to those of you that have done a little bit more dressmaking. But now I've got my marks into position, I can then slip my glove off, I can grab my scissors, make sure that I haven't got anything that's going to get in the way when I cut the leather off. So I'm just going to sort of almost pull the finger, sort of the sides of the finger there, so I can sort of see where my marks are. I want to get a nice level cut that's going to join up those two, checking the back to make sure that nothing is going to be getting in the way. What I found last time is that I did one cut and then I went back in to get a little bit closer, so we'll just see how it looks when I've cut both sides off. By sort of squishing it down a bit more, you can see where those sort of two edges are. Just make sure, of course, that you're not going to catch anything on the back, because believe me, there is nothing more frustrating than catching your threads. So in fact, my marks are on the other side here, so I'm going to have my marks facing me rather than having them the wrong direction. That makes a bit more sense. So same thing again, whether your marks are on the inside or the outside, you want to level the top, make sure that you're not going to cut any threads off, and then we can cut off our ends of our fourchettes. We can have a little look, and if there's any sort of bits, sometimes you might find, you can see it just a little bit here, I shall zoom in to show you, we've got a slight kind of almost sort of little tip here where I've just sort of gone up as I've cut the leather off. I'm going to use my little scissors for that, and we're just going to level that off so we can get rid of that little sort of fluffy triangular bit there. So just have a quick check, and then it's exactly the same procedure to finish the thread off, where you go over the ends just like we did on the index finger. And then I will, once I've finished my thread off, there we go, just straighten that a little bit more, I will then insert the fourchette on the fourth finger, and then I will come back and we'll talk the fifth finger after that. I've now stitched the fourchettes completely for the middle finger and for the fourth finger, and I'm now getting ready to do the fifth finger. I've stitched in exactly the same way up to the end of my trank, and I've just left the fourchette for the moment. I'm going to trim it and finish the thread in exactly the same way, but what I would like to do first is to make sure that this side is sewn up, so that when I bring my thread up to the top here, I know that I can then just check that those sort of final stitches at the top of the fourchette side are in exactly the right place where I want them. Now I've been sort of trying on the glove, and I've allowed a little bit on the side seam so that I've got a little bit of room to get into my glove. So I won't be starting all the way at the bottom here. I will actually be starting a little bit further up, somewhere around here, and then I will go up to the top. Now I worked this out just by clipping and also by sort of checking and trying it on to sort of work out the best place to do that particular stitch, and then I've now got it tacked and ready to go for this last run of stitching. So just to recap, I'm starting my thread down towards the base of the glove. I've made a little mark actually with a silver pen so I know where exactly I need to come out, and my starting stitches are within the area that I'm going to be stitching over. I've gone through the leather just to make a very small stitch. I'm then going to make sure that I pinch my tail on this side here and take my thread through again to make that loop. So it's the same starting stitch that we've been doing throughout. Before I start sewing, what I will do is just hammer it flat, and you'll notice a difference there like we have done throughout, to make sure that it's nice and flat and a little bit more comfortable. So let's just pull that nice and flat, trim off our ends, we'll give it a very quick hammer, and then we will be off on our stitching. So just the same as when we were sewing up our main glove, I'm going to come out near my silver mark so that I know where I'm starting, and I'm starting with a back stitch. Let me just show you. So my mark is almost rubbing itself off, but we'll start off before we do. So coming out, so I'm going to go backwards, and then I'm just going to work my pre-stitch all the way up to the top. So I just want to make sure that everything is nice and level, and then I'm going to do my back stitch. And again, if you wanted to sort of reinforce this, you could do a second stitch if you wish, and then we're going to be off and on our way with our sewing. So I've now almost completed my back stitch, and I just want to check both sides of the leather to be certain I'm happy with where I'm coming out, because we want our stitch line and our stitch length to be nice and consistent. So I'm just going to work my way up to the top of the glove, and then we'll show you the next stage. We're almost there. So I've now sewn up that final side seam, and I can sort of see the rest of the glove in situ, and I can now mark up and trim my fourchette, and then I'm just going to show you one way that I've found to finish the thread off, which is very similar to what we've been doing, but it might just help if you wanted a sort of more uniform look to the sort of final tops of your seams. So I've trimmed our fourchette, and I've just picked up one of my needles that was hanging loose there to start to finish off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the top of the glove here a couple of times. So I'll show you in real time. So make sure, as you would have done throughout, that those stitches are resting together. We don't want them to sort of be split, and again make sure they're pulled nice and firmly. I'm going to go through a second time, and then we are going to just make another stitch coming from this side here down into, there we go, into this one here. So in effect I'm sort of filling in just one gap this time. You can do additional gaps if you wish, but what I'm going to do is almost go like I'm going to make a back stitch, putting the needle between the layers, so that I'm then going to, almost like I'm going back on myself, but I'm actually coming out in between the two layers of leather, and then I'm going to weave my needle through to do my finishing stitches. Because we're working with those two threads, make sure that you've pulled them both nice and level, and then you're just going to weave through, checking that you aren't coming out in the leather or you can't see the needle, and we're just going to weave through like we've done before to finish the thread off. So I'll do my couple of weaving stitches, one more for luck if necessary, and then we will be able to cut the thread off and finish off the remaining threads in the same way. So we're going to go round the top twice, pulling the thread nice and flat each time, checking that everything is nice and level. Make sure that when you bring the needle back out that you are actually coming out through the hole. Sometimes it can skip and come out in slightly the wrong position on the leather. So now we want to just pick up and go right the way through, coming out in the same hole, and if it looks like it's shifted a little bit, just wiggle your needle so you're back in to where we want to finish. So we'll go round twice and then we do one little running stitch. So we're going to go down, oops, and again we're just going to make sure that we bring the needle out so that we can then go back on ourselves and then weave in between the leather. So I've come out on the left hand side of this stitch, I'm going to go into my leather again here, and this time I'm going to bring my needle out between the two layers to do my finishing stitches. So we'll just wiggle that through. This is where it can be helpful to have a pair of pliers, because it can help just to pull the needle through without sort of stressing your fingers or your hands. So we'll just pull that nice and flat, and then I'm just going to weave through so that I'm catching under my stitches, coming out again in the leather. This is where you've just got to keep an eye on the position of the needle. We don't want to poke it out and sort of perforate the leather, but we do want to make sure that we're finishing our stitches nice and neatly. So sometimes it's quite useful just to have a finger and allow the thread to run over the finger, and then you're able to finish it off. So I'm quite happy with those two finishing stitches, so we'll cut that one off, and then we'll just repeat that process again for the final thread. And here we have the finished gloves. I have to say I'm really pleased with the fit. I think I might be tempted to just take a little bit more, maybe an extra 3 or 4 millimeters off the length of the fingers, but they've come together really well. I'm really happy with the fit. I think I'm interested perhaps in maybe developing the ideas for the back of the hands a little bit more, sort of looking maybe at adding some points as well to future designs. But all I need now really is a sports car to go driving. So enjoy wearing your fingerless gloves and wear them with pride. Thank you for watching, everyone.